we're well on the road to WrestleMania, so you know what that means. Time to talk about Tokusatsu. Wrestling and Tokusatsu have an interesting shared history, with quite a bit of give and take between the two mediums, even with several enmascarados styling themselves after Super Sentai characters, and several even adapting Ultraman. The original to do so growing so popular that he got to shake hands with the real Ultraman.
Hey Squid, you know Ultraman isn't real, right? It's important to me that you know this.
Let's just move on. Both tokusatsu and wrestling rose to prominence in Japan at roughly the same time period, with the first major toku boom beginning in the 50s, while the same decade saw wrestling become popularized by Korean-Japanese wrestler Riki Dozan. Riki Dozan had trained quite a few wrestlers prior to his murder in 1963, but he had two star pupils. Giant Baba, a Goliath of a man who was almost as tall as Andre the Giant, and the incredibly technically impressive Antonio Inoki, who once fought Muhammad Ali in a legitimate mixed martial arts bout. Don't watch it though, this was the infancy of MMA, so they hadn't quite figured out how it should work. In 1972, roughly 9 years after their mentor's death, Inoki and Baba founded rival wrestling companies, Baba starting All Japan Pro Wrestling while Inoki founded New Japan Pro Wrestling. Someone was feeling petty, but I could not tell you who. Both companies are still around today, but New Japan is definitely the more well-known of the two, having several international talent-sharing deals and helping many Western stars rise to prominence. In the 80s, New Japan licensed the rights to wrestling manga Tiger Mask to adapt its protagonist into a real wrestler. Now, to the uninitiated, this sounds silly. Who would buy that a fictional character is suddenly real and wrestling? But for wrestling fans, yeah, that tracks. And Tiger Mask got over huge. So huge in fact that not only has the Tiger Mask character been passed down to multiple wrestlers, but the same has been done for Black Tiger, one of the antagonists of the manga, with his second iteration being portrayed by the late great Eddie Guerrero.
This all went over so well that when New Japan saw the possibility to make Lightning Strike Twice, they took it. A cross-promotional deal was struck for New Japan to adapt the protagonist of Jushin Liger, a series created by Go Nagai. Interestingly, Jushin Liger is not about wrestling. It's a superhero series about Ken Taiga, a young boy with the spirit of a great god warrior inside him, which he must call upon to do battle with demons. Best way it can be described is Ultraman meets Devilman, with mecha anime tropes liberally sprinkled in. This isn't too odd to be adapted to wrestling. Wrestlers have been depicted as a type of superhero for quite some time. Something interesting would happen, though.
While Tiger Mask, both the wrestler and multimedia franchise, have remained pretty equal in popularity, Jushin Liger, the wrestler, almost completely eclipsed his counterpart on the page. Also, unlike Tiger Mask, Jushin Liger has only ever been played by one person, Keiichi Yamada. He would go on to have encounters with not just legendary Japanese wrestlers like the Great Muta, but legendary Western wrestlers like Macho Man Randy Savage, Eddie Guerrero, and Rey Mysterio Jr., as well as sharing the ring with future stars like Bryan Danielson, and Western audiences became acquainted with him through his regular appearances on WCW. His storied history in the industry led him to being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, despite only ever working a handful of matches for them directly.
And in 1995, he would be given a tokusatsu film, Jushin Thunder Liger, Fist of Thunder. Produced by Bandai Visual, the film has a few plot beats from the original manga and anime, but reformats it to be focused on wrestling rather than it being a superhero story. It's like the inverse of what El Santo had been doing for years.
So I guess the real question is, why? Why is there so much crossover between tokusatsu and wrestling? Well, in addition to gaining major popularity in the same time period, by the nature of the mediums, they share a lot of the same tropes. They both feature larger-than-life characters, sometimes figuratively, sometimes literally, beset by the forces of evil.
There's no Hulkamaniacs here!
The major portions of the story are then told not through dialogue, but through body language, both requiring not just high athletic ability, but the ability to emote convincingly with one's entire body. What's really confusing is how obscure this movie is. WCW and WWE were obsessed with gaining crossover appeal for their product. Something that unfortunately hasn't gone away. They wanted their stars in TV shows and movies. We as a society were plagued annually with films that starred Hulk Hogan as the lead, and no one did anything about it!
And then Turner Broadcasting was practically handed this movie for one of their most aesthetically identifiable stars and just said, nah. You can't even argue it was an industry predisposition against Toku and Japanese media, because Mighty Morphin Power Rangers premiered 2 years before this movie released, and that printed money the way wrestling action figures can only hope to.
This one sweats.
Okay.
This is all to say, due to the film's obscurity, we have to watch it with no subtitles. Sorry.
I mean, it's probably more coherent to have no subtitles at all than to read subtitles translated from Malaysian, then translated to Chinese, then translated to English. But yeah, let's just start the movie.
So, turns out it's really hard to riff a movie if you can't understand the words being said. So in lieu of that, here's Goldn watching Scott Steiner speak for the first time.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
I know that.
I'm smart.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. No. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Stop being a baby. Plus, Booker called first.
A baby?
A baby?
I'm good at eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Who is that first?
I'm gonna eeny meeny miny mo.
We're not really able to comment on how well the specifics of the film's story are told, but what we can parse from the story is this. Ever seen Rocky IV? It's like that, with the plot element of another wrestler, Rhett Orff, being killed by the bad guy, the Gaijin wrestler Viper, and Liger having to avenge him, but combined with a bit of Kamen Rider Shin at the end, meaning there's a battle between two guys in monster suits, and the transformation for both looks painful.
The story takes a lot of time setting itself up. After the beginning of the film, we don't see another actual match until roughly the halfway point. They've basically front-loaded the exposition, so the entire second half is entirely wrestling and tokusatsu. While the actual character and story building is inaccessible to us, there are several things I'd want to talk about. In this film, despite Liger being a wrestler who usually stays masked even in public appearances, Liger spends the majority of this movie without his mask on. Thing is though, that's not Liger. There's a different actor, Masuda Matsuda, playing him while he's unmasked. Matsuda is an actor who's no stranger to Toku, playing Satoru Yoshida in Ultraman Gaia, and both Dorem's voice in human form in Ultraman Tiga: The Final Odyssey.
My friend.
A year after this film was released, Liger would unmask for real in a match against the Great Muta. Though unmask is relative here, because his entire face is painted as this marked him transforming into his Kishin Liger form. But even then you can tell this is a different person. Now, was the transformation inspired by the movie? I don't know. No contemporary English language sources reference this movie when discussing this event, but I suppose it could have put the concept into the mind of the creative team at New Japan. The cinematography in the first half of the film is a little weird. At first the movie made me think that it was going to be shot the same way WWE shot its backstage segments in the 90s and early 2000s, which would be an interesting concept to turn the entire movie into what would amount to being a wrestling show that becomes a Toku movie in the latter half. But that quickly becomes clear that's not what they're doing. These segments on wrestling shows are often shot for efficiency and avoiding camera cuts whenever possible. They just shared that in common. Otherwise, we get weird shots, like this. Why am I so high up?
This brings us to the director, Takuya Wada, who's also the co-writer. The only other writer only did this film, so I get the idea he's someone from probably the wrestling end of things. Wada primarily seems to be an animator, animation director, and character designer, with this being his first live-action project. He did one more live-action film after this, Yaju Densetsu Dragon Blue, which is another piece with Toku effects. With all the dramatic close-ups and angles during this movie's fight scene, it definitely has the vibe of an animation director being given a live-action production, and trying to replicate a different medium's styles. The cheesy stock sound effects add to that vibe.
The latter half is what really grabbed my attention. The wrestling scenes are shot well, using the typical angles you'd expect of a wrestling show. So many movies about wrestling just refuse to use hard camera, and not having it is so counterintuitive to following the action of a wrestling match. Something that's a little bit noticeable is the fact that Viper's physique changes mid-match. This is due to the fact that if you are going to be using actual wrestling moves, it helps to have someone properly trained and with a workout routine that leaves them in what's called ring shape. This isn't really the fault of the film. In fact, I think it's better than using someone untrained. It just draws attention to itself because they cast a bodybuilder, Muscle Kitamura, as Viper, and Jesus Christ, I didn't know they made humans in that size.
The close-ups of the Bio Rider faces look fairly impressive. Well lit, the animatronic is convincing, fairly moist. It's good stuff. It's delightfully gross and looks about as good as the stuff Toei was producing at the time. In fact, it might look a little better, at least in terms of suit design, because I think more seasoned tokusatsu franchises had better fight scenes at this point. It's not bad, I just don't think it takes full advantage of the fact that it's set in the world of wrestling. It's a mostly straight back and forth between two roided out monster dudes. It does help that the entire fight scene takes place in a dark, damp environment, and the fact that all we have of this film is on VHS helps hide imperfections. Seeing all the unconnected bits of the costumes flop around during the fight scene kinda ruins the effect, and the goofy synth score takes a bit away from the effect they were going for, but hey, it's Suitmation. It's inherently not gonna look totally convincing, but I do enjoy watching it.
The effects and suits were designed by Steve Wang, who was known for his work with creature effects on tons of films, including on films like Predator, which isn't a surprise, and his work on the Guyver films. Tomohyaku Take, where this film served as one of his earliest credits before moving on to tons of well-known work, like The Great Yokai War and Big Man Japan. Yuichi Matsue, who would go on to do tons of work on both sides of the Grudge franchise, to even working with Tarantino on Kill Bill. And those are just the names we know, so plenty of talent went into this. It's just a shame that this fight scene feels a little generic. Like, it's good, but nothing really sets it apart, which is a shame for a Toku film with a focus on professional wrestling. They do bust out a powerbomb, I'll give them that, but like, a choke slam, put someone through a table, put someone in a camel clutch. It lacks the wrestling flair and feels more like that thing when a wrestler will bust out their finisher in a movie fight scene, but otherwise it's just a normal fight scene. The ending of the fight is not too special either. Liger summons a lightning bolt and sets Viper's body and his henchmen ablaze. Kane was summoning more convincing lightning bolts live a few years later. Then Liger sulks away and we get a tease at a sequel that didn't happen, unless we're to consider the next Liger appearance on TV a sequel. Who knows? The real treat is the behind-the-scenes featurette after the credits. I've always had a passion for practical VFX and the processes behind them. They're endlessly fascinating. If you're anything like me, this is for you. I can't recommend the full movie, especially in its unsubbed state, which is a shame because it lowers the chance of fan subs being done even further, but definitely the final fight scene and the behind-the-scenes featurette are worth your time. Yes, I'm unironically telling you to watch this movie like a young child watches Godzilla movies, and skip to the monster scenes.
The fight scene itself is on YouTube, so like, the good part of the movie is fairly accessible.
I can't believe I forgot this. They put a fake old man in this movie. You couldn't find a real old man? Are there no old men you could find? Thank you so much for watching. First, I want to thank Golden for joining me in this video. Definitely check out their content over at ZaGorudan, link in the description. Shout out to my patrons, Ned Rex, Tentacle Teapot, and AJ Wigglesworth. If you want to support me, you can go to patreon.com/hsquid. If you want to support Golden, you can go over to patreon.com/ZaGorudan. Links to both in the description.